Okay, so I've suggested to you that one of the central questions in ecology is to understand what controls the distribution and abundance of individuals. Where do we find them? How many? What different kinds? How many kinds? Right? Community ecology is at this sort of how many kinds level usually, but studying competition, studying populations, studying ecosystems, all of this question strikes through all of those. And so far I've been telling you communities are complicated, that we can't predict them very well, and we've been discussing how we would describe communities in terms of diversity, abundance, composition, and ecological relationships. Being able to quantify these different things about ecosystem and agreeing on what's important is important for hypothesis development, right? So if we have a hypothesis about why some communities are less species rich than others, then we can begin to do experiments to test those, right? And so an obvious experiment would be to ask, are communities saturated with species? And what happens if we add or remove them? Remember when we talked about the distribution of jack pine, which is roughly here in North America? It could probably, that missed, but it would probably be able to survive in parts of Russia. And so what would happen if we moved jack pine there? That could be a really interesting experiment to do. Similarly, if we went to back to our network, right? If we started, removing fruit flies in this completely made-up example that only pollinates one species, that might be a problem. Or if we remove this plant, then that might kill the fruit fly, right? So obviously, both of these experiments can be slightly unethical, but humans are frequently unethical, and we have invasive species and extinctions, which can happen sort of unintended, but due to human commerce. And these provide natural experiments that ecologists frequently take advantage of. So here's an example: purple loosestrife lives in the same niche as cattails, and you'll often see them commingled in marshes around here. And you can sort of see this old figure that tracks its spread from the 1830s to isolated records in the 1980s, where it had gone through Indiana and through Illinois. You can find it in marshes in Illinois today. Okay, so let's go back to the scientific method. We have an observation. Alien species often are able to invade communities. Right, so purple loosestrife, there is the emerald ash borer that's destroying ash trees, the Dutch elm disease that killed off a lot of elm trees in the 1950s, chestnut blight that wiped out all the chestnuts practically in North America, right? So if these alien species can come in, we might ask, are communities saturated with species? Right, so we can have two alternative hypotheses, and we don't know the answer. They are saturated or they aren't. And what this leads us to two different predictions, right? So if communities are saturated, then the most species-rich communities should have the fewest invaders because there's no room for them. The niches are all full, right? So if you have a really species-rich community, you simply can't add many invasive species because there's no more niche space that's available. If communities aren't saturated, then we might expect a positive correlation between the number of species in an environment. Remember, this community might have fewer species than this one because of environmental reasons. And so what we can do is we can look at these kinds of correlations in nature to see what we actually see. People have done this in lots of different ways. Here's one of the simpler figures I found from 1999. Communities really don't appear to be saturated almost ever. So you've got the native species richness from a bunch of different communities, and the invasive or exotic species. And over and over again, ecologists find that this is a positive relationship. So communities do not appear to be saturated at all. Apparently, we can just keep adding more and more species without any real limit. And remember, I suggested that coexistence is about population persistence. I suspect this has my face on top of it, but population persistence, right? So we can also ask if we can add invasive species, apparently without much limit, we could also ask, do invasive species cause local extinctions? So this is what a friend of mine, Mark Vellen, did in a paper that is very controversial, but he was able to get a huge amount of data from everywhere in the world, again, mostly where rich white people hang out, but some data from all around the world. And he could ask the question, do invasive species cause extinctions? Again, if they're filling niches that should be held by native species, then we should expect to see a lot of native extinctions. So what you're looking at here is a log response ratio, just like we saw in the lab that time. And if it's in the middle, it says that there's no effect size, and he's got it broken up by a bunch of different habitats. What we see is that all of these, right, and so here is like the mean with its error bars, which we know how to understand now, that except for in a couple examples, there is almost no effect because the error bar is overlapping with 0. And so if we look at the distribution of these, remember we talked about how error bars summarize distributions in lab, we can see that the mean effect size is 0. And so what does this mean? What's the point that I'm trying to get you to think about, right? So it doesn't seem like invasive species very often cause extinction of native species. Apparently, communities aren't saturated. We can just keep adding species from anywhere in the world, and it just increases diversity. So what does this mean? I usually get at least one student, usually a couple more, that come up to me at the end of this lecture. Maybe I'll get some comments on YouTube to this effect that tell me that this is dangerous. Aren't native species or aren't invasive species a problem? And I would argue that there's really strong evidence that they aren't a problem. So what should we do about invasive species? It's okay, in my opinion, not to like them. So my backyard, I've converted much of my lawn into native prairie because I value native species, and that's okay. I think that sometimes ecologists are uncomfortable as scientists with the idea that we have cultural and societal values. It's okay to value native species even if scientifically they're not actually potentially causing that much trouble. So my yard is full of native species. I'm constantly removing invasive ones. I'm a strong supporter of the removal of invasive species. The difference is that I just recognize that that is a cultural value that I have rather than something that's driven by science showing the horrifying prospects of invasive species. Sometimes this stresses students out, but I think it's okay, like in the ecosystem services where we could have cultural ecosystem services. Those are important, and science doesn't mean we can't have art and that we can't have things that we love. All right, so review. We can think about what are the many kinds of ecological interactions. Right, that table I showed you with 9 cells, that triangle matrix. What is the difference between open and closed community concepts? How do we potentially test? What does nature actually look like? Think about ecological succession and the difference between primary and secondary succession. What are the different ways to describe communities? And which information do these methods include or ignore? Know about the species area curve and how it potentially limits our ability to understand communities, and we're going to do a whole lab on this. And are communities saturated with species and invasive species in particular, and how do we know? So that's the stuff that I'd like you to know for this lecture. Yeah, so that's my community and community structure lecture.